first time I saw Michelle, she stood at the edge of my porch, hesitant. The wind had picked up, rustling through the trees surrounding my cabin, carrying with it the weight of something unspoken. I could tell she had been crying. Red-rimmed eyes, a face pale from exhaustion, she looked like someone who had been running from a storm, only to find herself caught in its center. I run a therapy retreat here, away from the noise of the world. People come when they're lost, broken, or searching for something they can't name. I've seen grief, anger, regret, but Michelle's sadness was different. It clung to her like an old coat, heavy and suffocating. She didn't speak right away. Instead, she stood there, gripping the straps of her bag as if it was the only thing keeping her together. When she finally met my eyes, her voice was barely above a whisper. "My husband left," she said. "He took the kids with him." The words hung between us, raw and bitter. I stepped aside, motioning her in. "Come inside." She hesitated but eventually crossed the threshold, the scent of burning firewood and pine wrapping around her like a hesitant embrace. She didn't shake off the cold, though. It clung to her as she sat at the wooden table, her hands wrapped around a cup of tea I had placed in front of her. "I don't know why I came here," she admitted after a long silence. I waited. People often said that when they arrived, but deep down, they always knew. I feel like I don't exist anymore," she continued, staring into the tea as if it held the answers she was looking for. "One day, I was a wife and a mother. The next, I was nothing." Her voice cracked, and she clenched her jaw, refusing to let the tears fall. I had seen that before, the desperate attempt to hold it all in, to be strong even when everything inside was unraveling. "You're still here," I told her. "You still exist." She let out a hollow laugh. "But what does that even mean?" I leaned forward, resting my hands on the warm wood of the table. "It means you're not just what you've lost. It means you're still becoming." She looked at me then, really looked at me, as if she wanted to believe that. As if she needed to. Outside, the wind howled through the trees, but inside, for the first time since she arrived, Michelle let herself breathe. Michelle wrapped her hands around the warm ceramic of her teacup, staring down into it as if searching for answers in the swirling liquid. "I keep replaying that night in my head," she murmured. "The night he left." I stayed silent, letting her continue at her own pace. "He said he couldn't do it anymore," she whispered. "That I wasn't the same person he married. That I had changed." She let out a bitter laugh. "Of course, I changed. We had 2 kids, built a life together. How could I not?" She shook her head, blinking rapidly. "He told me he needed to be happy. And that I wasn't making him happy anymore." The words had clearly left a scar, one she traced over and over in her mind, trying to make sense of it. I sighed. People convince themselves of a lot of things when they're looking for an excuse to leave. She looked up at me, surprised. "You think that's what he was doing?" "I think people rarely leave just because of one thing," I said carefully. "And I think people like to rewrite the story in their heads to justify their choices." Her throat bobbed as she swallowed hard. "I just don't understand why he had to take the kids." I softened. "That's the part that hurts the most, isn't it?" She nodded, pressing her lips together to stop them from trembling. "They were my whole world." "Or," I corrected, "they are your whole world." She let out a shuddering breath, her hands tightening around the cup. "I don't know how to move forward from this." I studied her for a moment. "You don't have to have all the answers right now. You just have to be willing to start." She wiped her eyes, frustration flickering in them. "And if I don't know how to start?" I gestured around the cabin. "Then that's why you're here." She exhaled slowly, nodding, as if allowing herself to accept that maybe, just maybe, she didn't have to figure it all out on her own. She inhaled shakily. "The night he left," she hesitated, then let out a small, hollow laugh. "It wasn't even a fight. You'd think there would have been shouting, accusations, something dramatic. But it wasn't like that. It was quiet. Too quiet. I watched as her fingers curled around the ceramic, her knuckles white. He packed a bag, she continued. Didn't even try to hide it. Just did it right in front of me. I asked him what he was doing, and he didn't look at me. He just kept folding his shirts, one by one, like he was going on a business trip. Like it was nothing. She swallowed hard. I asked him where he was going. He said he didn't know. I asked him if he'd be back. He said he didn't think so. A breath shuddered out of her. That was it. That was all I got. Outside, the wind howled through the trees, rattling against the windows. I should have seen it coming, she murmured, more to herself than to me. But you don't see the cracks when you're too busy holding everything together. She exhaled sharply, shaking her head. Looking back, I can trace the moments, the small ways he started pulling away. The way he'd come home later and later. The way he'd avoid my touch, the way his laughter became forced when he was around me. She clenched her jaw. But I didn't want to believe it. I thought if I just worked harder, if I was more patient, more understanding, he'd come back to me. But he was already gone. I just didn't know it yet. I let her words settle, let her sit with the weight of them. Was he a good husband? I asked gently. She let out a breathy, bitter laugh. At first. When we met, he made me feel like I was the center of the universe. You know that feeling? When someone looks at you like you're the most fascinating thing they've ever seen? I nodded. That's how he was in the beginning. He noticed everything about me, the way I tucked my hair behind my ear when I was nervous, the way I hummed under my breath when I cooked. He made me feel seen. Her lips pressed together, and she looked away. But over time, he stopped seeing me. Or maybe, he only saw the version of me he didn't want anymore. She ran a hand through her hair, exhaling sharply. I changed. I became a mother. My body changed, my priorities changed. And I guess he didn't want that version of me. Maybe he wanted the woman I used to be, the one who laughed easily, who had energy for late-night adventures, who didn't carry the weight of two small lives on her shoulders. Her voice cracked. But that version of me didn't exist anymore. A tear slipped down her cheek, but she wiped it away before it could fall completely. I watched her for a long moment before asking, "And what about you? Did you still love him?" She inhaled sharply, as if the question had physically hit her. She opened her mouth, then closed it, her brows drawing together. She shook her head. I don't know. The admission seemed to startle her. I loved the idea of us, she murmured. The life we built. The stability. The promise of forever. But love? She let out a slow breath. I think I was too exhausted to even recognize it anymore. The firelight flickered against her face, casting shifting shadows. But I would have stayed, she admitted. Even if it wasn't the same. I would have stayed because of the kids. Because that's what you do. You don't just leave. She let out a harsh laugh. But he did. The words sat heavy between us. I studied her carefully. And what about before him? She blinked, caught off guard. What? Before him, I said. Before the marriage, before the kids. Before all of it. Who were you then? She looked down at her hands, as if trying to remember. I don't know, she admitted after a long pause. It's been so long since I thought about her. A sad smile tugged at her lips. She used to paint. Did you know that? I shook my head. She loved it. The smell of oils and turpentine, the way colors blended together on the canvas. She used to lose herself in it. A distant look came into her eyes. And she loved the ocean. The sound of the waves, the feeling of salt on her skin. She always thought she'd live by the water one day. Her expression shifted, something like grief, but not quite. But then she met him. And she traded paintbrushes for baby bottles. Traded ocean waves for a house in the suburbs. She let out a soft, almost wistful laugh. And she was happy, for a while. Or at least, she thought she was. She met my gaze, something uncertain in her expression. Do you think she's still in there? That girl? I nodded. She never left. She's just been waiting for you to remember her. Michelle inhaled sharply, her grip tightening around the cup. I don't know how to find her again, she whispered. I leaned forward. That's why you're here. She held my gaze for a long moment, something shifting in her eyes. Not quite hope, but the possibility of it. And for now, that was enough. Michelle let out a slow breath, staring down into her tea as if the swirling liquid might hold an answer she hadn't found yet. She used to be fearless, you know, she murmured. That girl. Before him, before all of this. She wasn't afraid of starting over. I stayed quiet, sensing she was still wading through memories, tracing the outline of who she used to be. She once quit a stable job just because she wanted something different. A ghost of a smile flickered across her lips. Didn't even have a backup plan. Just walked out, bought a train ticket to the coast, and spent the entire summer working at a little art shop near the water. She didn't make much money, but she was happy. Her fingers tightened around the cup. I can't remember the last time I felt like that. I studied her. What happened to her? Michelle exhaled. Life. She shook her head, her expression turning pained. Somewhere along the way, she stopped believing in reinvention. Stopped believing she could be anything other than what she had become. She met a man who wanted stability, and she convinced herself that was enough. She thought love meant sacrifice. That she had to trade in parts of herself to make room for someone else. She let out a soft, bitter laugh. And then, one day, he decided he didn't want what she had left. Silence settled between us. The fire crackled, casting shadows against the log walls. She's still in there, I said again. That girl. Michelle looked away. She feels so far away. She's not. She swallowed hard. Then why does it feel like I don't know how to reach her? I leaned back in my chair, watching her closely. Maybe because you're still mourning who you were. Not just as a wife, but as a person. Maybe you're grieving the parts of yourself you lost before he even walked away. She flinched, as if the words had struck something deep. I don't know who I am without them, she admitted. Without the kids, without him. Without the life I built. I nodded. Then maybe it's time to build something new. Michelle let out a slow breath. Ow! I gestured around the cabin. You start small. You wake up, you take a breath, and you do one thing for yourself. Just one. You sit outside with your tea. You take a walk in the woods. You pick up a paintbrush again. You remember what it feels like to exist outside of someone else's expectations. Her eyes glistened, but she didn't look away. It won't happen overnight, I said gently. But the fact that you're asking how means you're ready to try. She blinked rapidly, then exhaled, nodding. Okay. The word was barely a whisper, but it carried the weight of something important. A first step. Outside, the wind continued to howl through the trees. But inside, for the first time since she arrived, Michelle looked like she might finally be willing to step out of the storm. The next morning, Michelle sat on the porch, her hands wrapped around a fresh cup of tea. The steam curled into the cold morning air as the forest slowly stirred to life around her. Birds called softly in the distance, and the wind rustled through the trees, shaking loose the last remnants of winter. She was still here. That was something. I stepped outside, leaning against the railing. How'd you sleep? She let out a breathy laugh. I didn't. I nodded, unsurprised. That's normal. She glanced at me, something tired but searching in her expression. When does it stop hurting? I took a long breath, considering my words. It doesn't just stop. It shifts. Changes shape. Some days, it's quieter. Other days, it sneaks up on you when you least expect it. But eventually, it won't feel like it's swallowing you whole. She nodded slowly, as if she didn't quite believe me but wanted to. For a long moment, we just sat there in the quiet. Then, almost hesitantly, Michelle spoke again. I had a dream last night. I glanced at her, waiting. I was standing on the shore, watching the waves come in. The tide kept rising, higher and higher, until it was at my feet. I knew I should move, but I couldn't. I just stood there, letting it pull me under. She shook her head. But right before I went under completely, I saw her. Her. She swallowed. Me. The old me. The girl I used to be. I stayed silent, letting her find the words. She was standing on the other side of the water, watching me. She looked free. Like she wasn't afraid. Michelle exhaled sharply. And then she turned and walked away. I wanted to call out, to run after her, but the water, she broke off, her fingers tightening around the mug. I studied her carefully. Do you think she was leaving you behind? Or do you think she was showing you the way forward? Michelle blinked, startled by the question. She opened her mouth, then closed it, as if trying to decide. I don't know, she admitted. But I think I want to find out. A small, knowing smile tugged at my lips. Then start walking. She let out breath, shaking her head. It's not that simple. No, I agreed. It's not. But staying still isn't any easier. She fell quiet again, staring into the trees. After a moment, she sighed. I don't know how to be alone. I met her gaze. Then learn. Her throat bobbed as she swallowed. And what if I fail? I shrugged. Then you try again. She let out breath, rubbing a hand over her face. I keep thinking about them, she admitted. The kids. What they're doing right now, if they miss me, if he tells them anything about me. Her voice wavered. What if they forget me? They won't. She looked at me, eyes glassy with unshed tears. How do you know? Because love doesn't just disappear, I said simply. And neither does a mother's place in her children's hearts. Her lips trembled, and for a moment, I thought she might break again. But she didn't. Instead, she inhaled sharply and nodded. I want to be strong, she whispered. You already are. She let out a watery laugh. I don't feel like it. Strength isn't about how you feel, I told her. It's about what you do, even when you feel like falling apart. She stared at me for a long time. Then, finally, she exhaled and looked out at the trees again. I used to love the woods, she murmured. When I was a kid, I'd spend hours outside, pretending I was an explorer, climbing trees, making up stories about magical places hidden in the forest. She smiled faintly. Somewhere along the way, I forgot about that. I nudged my chin toward the trees. Then maybe today's a good day to remember. She hesitated, then looked down at her hands. I don't even know where to start. I nodded toward the steps. Start by taking a walk. She let out a small laugh, shaking her head. But then, after a moment, she stood. She set down her tea, took a deep breath, and stepped off the porch. I watched as she hesitated at the tree line, looking into the woods as if seeing them for the first time. Then, slowly, she took a step forward. And then another. The wind stirred the trees, the leaves whispering in approval. Michelle disappeared into the forest, her silhouette swallowed by the tall pines. And I knew, without a doubt, that she would find her way back.